Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating cultural paradox. We're going to explore how the electric guitar's greatest icon, a musician celebrated for just boundless freedom and innovation, actually kind of inadvertently helped build a massive cultural barrier. It's a story about music for sure, but it's also a story about mythology, society, and ultimately, who gets to hold the power.
So, let's dive right into this by asking a seemingly impossible question. How on earth did one man's guitar playing bridge ancient Greek mythology, the evolution of jazz, and modern feminist theory? I know, right? It sounds like a massive stretch, but as we look closer at his legacy, you'll see exactly how these wildly different worlds collide.
Section 1. The Unlikely Guitar God. Before the fame, before the psychedelic clothes, and definitely before the sold-out stadiums, Jimi Hendrix had a frankly disastrous stint in the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division. He enlisted back in May 1961, mostly just to avoid jail time for riding in a stolen car, and while he promptly failed the shooting range in basic training. By the time he actually reached Fort Campbell, his primary focus was just neglecting his military duties so he could sit around and practice his guitar.
And wow, his military superiors were brutally, almost comically honest about his performance. His official 1962 discharge paperwork explicitly stated he had, quote, no known good characteristics, and even noted he was caught in compromising situations, like masturbating, while he was supposed to be on detail. Honestly, this just firmly establishes the young Hendrix as a deeply flawed, everyday human being who just wanted to play his instrument. It is a far cry from the divine figure he'd eventually become.
But contrast that military record with what came next. Just a few short years later, his musical peers were suddenly referring to him in these strictly magical, deeply reverent terms. Pete Townshend of The Who famously called him a shaman who worked miracles. This is the pivot right here. The struggling, unmotivated soldier had transformed into something entirely otherworldly to literally anyone who watched him play.
In fact, academics studying Hendrix actually describe him as a modern Dionysian figure. This ties back to the ancient Greek god Dionysus, who represents wild, ecstatic, completely rule-breaking performance. Just think about Hendrix at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival. He didn't just play his guitar, he engaged in a literal ritual sacrifice, burning it right there on stage. This action, which perfectly mirrored ancient festival rites, completely elevated the electric guitar from a mere piece of wood into a mythical artifact, and it turned the player into a god.
Section 2. Reshaping the sound of jazz.
So, he revolutionized the whole sonic vocabulary of modern music, most notably popularizing what is now universally known as the Hendrix chord. Technically speaking, it's the dominant 7-sharp-9 chord. But culturally, it is the literal sound of aggressive, volatile, emotional content. It perfectly mimics that Dionysian wrath and madness we were just talking about. He injected this furious, raw emotion into his playing, which completely captivated serious jazz innovators who were desperately looking for a new direction.
And you can see how this crossover profoundly impacted jazz legend Miles Davis. He actually became obsessed with Hendrix's sound. You can trace this evolution directly across his albums. In a Silent Way brought the electric guitar right to the center. Then Bitches Brew fully embraced that loud, confrontational energy and long-form improvisation. And by the time we get to A Tribute to Jack Johnson, Davis is fully utilizing aggressive electric guitar and heavy rock drumming. Hendrix's mythology was quite literally reshaping jazz.
Section 3. The masculinization of technology. Now, stepping into the academic realm, we can start to see how the very tools of this musical revolution became deeply and almost exclusively gendered. The electric guitar wasn't just wood and wire anymore. No, it became completely loaded with cultural baggage. Driven by post-World War II DIY electronics, which, by the way, was heavily marketed as a male hobby, along with these aggressive rock performance styles, the electric guitar evolved. It became what sociologists actually call a technophallus. This physically imposing instrument, through its body positioning and those flamboyant on-stage displays, was used almost as a direct extension of the male body. It aggressively cemented rock and roll as a strictly male domain, constantly asserting dominance on stage. Section 4. The female guitarist experience. Because of all this, the culture divided the rock world into extremely rigid binary roles. Males were expected to be the active producers, the rock stars, the heroes. Females, on the other hand, were culturally expected to be the passive consumers, the audience, or the groupies. Within this incredibly strict framework, an active, loud female playing an electric guitar wasn't just seen as unusual. She was viewed by critics and the industry at large as an unnatural deviation from the accepted, submissive norm. And oh boy, when the instrument manufacturing industry finally tried to court female players, their approach was just incredibly misguided. Instead of actually addressing the cultural barriers, they created these so-called girl guitars, based on deeply insulting tropes. We're talking lighter bodies, pastel tint paint jobs, and literally heart and butterfly shapes. In one particularly absurd case, the Gibson Goddess line featured a direct marketing tie-in with agent provocateur lingerie. I mean, they were treating women as novelties and fantasies, not as serious musicians who just wanted quality instruments.
Section 5. Reclaiming the electric guitar.
Thankfully, the pushback against this has been incredibly effective, especially at the grassroots level. It really kicked into high gear with the Riot Girl movement in the early 90s, where women completely bypassed mainstream gatekeepers to create their own safe spaces for loud, uncompromising feminist punk rock. And building directly on that legacy is the rise of girls' rock camps all over the world today. These camps directly tackle those old institutional barriers by empowering young girls with immediate access to gear, solid instruction, and most crucially, loud, visible female role models.
It really calls to mind this brilliant quote from early electric guitar pioneer Charlie Christian. He advised that musicians should simply, quote, play their instruments the way they should be played. And honestly, that's exactly what's happening right now. The absolute best way to shatter these entrenched cultural barriers is to just keep playing unapologetically. You make the noise until the world is basically forced to listen, and forced to realize that talent isn't tied to a specific gender or some mythical archetype.
So, I want to leave you with this to chew on. If the guitar god was ultimately a myth built by and for men, starting with an unlikely soldier and ending up as a massive cultural barrier, what new truths are going to emerge when women fully reclaim the fretboard? How will the very sound of our culture change when the tools of musical power are truly, finally accessible to everyone? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.